Being forced to leave one's family, friends, and homeland can be a source of pain and leaves many people with a sense of loss. But for many, exile can also be a source of creativity through which they find ways to stay connected with a life that seems increasingly distant. Tenzin Tsundue is doing just that and much more. Tsundue is a Tibetan writer and activist, born and raised in India. He is an award-winning writer with 4 of his books translated into 15 languages. Tsundue combines activism with academia, touring educational institutions around the world, giving talks on exile writings, resistance, culture, and identity. He is one of the most familiar faces in the protest and rallies for the cause of Tibet. It is an honor having Tenzin Tsundue with us in Tibettv studio today. Tashle Tsundula.
Tashle.
Tsundula, so you have recently undertook this Talking Tibet Tour in US and Canada. And in fact, this is not your first time, it's the 4th one. I would like to first congratulate you to be able to tour 13 universities in 22 cities at 56 speaking events and in just 77 days. And that doesn't sound like an easy task. How did it go?
It went like a holiday.
Oh, nice.
Because in India, I travel for 6 to 7 months continuously, and I speak for about months and months. I travel and I speak in almost about 120 colleges in a year, and that has been my annual schedule. India is much more difficult. Here's a place where you're having to deal with auto rickshaw, bargain for the auto rickshaw price, and then having to find a place to stay in Lucknow, Kanpur, Indore, maybe in Rajasthan, Ahmedabad, in Kerala, Tamil Nadu. Of course, I have a number of Indian friends I stay with, and I eat their food and stay with them. So traveling in the US and Canada was much more easier because the Tibetan communities are so cooperative, so supportive, and because of my friends' support in the US and Canada, my speaking tour in 77 days went more like a holiday.
So Tsundula, tell us about your experience in terms of, let's first move on to your objective of this Talking Tibet Tour. And does this objective remain the same, or is it different this time? What was your focus in terms of your audience and your content of the talks?
Yeah, for me, my most important primary target is the American people and Canadian people. Because I wanted to say to them that when I come to Canada and the US, maybe I'm speaking in a different kind of a tone. Otherwise, when Tibetans go to Canada and America, it is not just seeking support or begging for support. I am saying in my speaking events that my main point is that United States and Canada, and of course all Western countries, they have for too many years, they have benefited at the cost of Tibet. They've been trading with China. For the past 25 to 30 years, they've been buying cheap made in China products, not having to dig up their own natural resources, not having to install dirty industries in their backyard, and not having to belabor their own people with obnoxious gas, the kind of things that Chinese people undergo having to produce cheap made in China products. In that way, you see that in Canada, America, and Western countries, almost about 80 to 85% of consumer goods are made in China. And these made in China products have been mainly produced by mining from Tibet and rehabilitating or throwing Tibetan nomads and farmers out of their own ancestral land and being kept in reservations kind of places where Tibetans are having to live in artificial villages and where their livelihood is at stake, their culture and their entire civilizational land is at the danger. So this is, the Tibetans are having to pay the price, and Western countries have been the main beneficiary. So I am saying to them, it is your responsibility to raise the issue of Tibet, support Tibet now when we are facing genocide. And then this is also what I wanted to tell Tibetans, that when they raise the issue of Tibet, they don't have to, sound begging. They have to speak to Western countries, especially governments, to make them accountable. How come that the Western countries would enjoy human rights and democracy in their country, and how come they have no clue about that in China and in China's occupied countries like Tibet or East Turkestan? I wanted to focus on unity within the Tibetan community. And elections come and go. Sikyongs will keep coming, but we have to be more understanding and adjusting within the community and focus on unity, and only then we will be able to come out and do something concrete for Tibet. And my important focus is also Tibetan youth. Tibetan youngsters in Western countries, they feel Tibetan. Their parents are Tibetan, or even mixed heritages. But many of them, they do not speak Tibetan language. And because of which sometimes they themselves feel not included or not invited also. So it is important for Tibetan youngsters, whether they not speak Tibetan or not being part of usual Tibetan gatherings, it is important for them to feel for Tibet, take the responsibility, and mainly take advantage of the unique Tibetan culture, which has the secret formula for inner peace and happiness. At the same time, they are in the West. They can take advantage of all the facilities and the great opportunities of job and rise in the social hierarchy. So you see, being Tibetan is such a blessing, and this is what I wanted Tibetan youngsters to understand and value it and be proud of it. Yeah.
Right. I want to come back to this, like having that sense of pride in one's identity. But before that, how did the audience respond? I'm sure there must have been a different varied experiences among Tibetans and non-Tibetans, and also the experience or the response reactions would have been different from the last time when you visited these countries, right? And also this time your Canada visit was the first time, right, to this. So overall, how did the audience respond?
Well, I've done many speaking tours in the UK, in Europe, and America, and my past experiences, I've seen they are these leftist American apologetic who would once in a while they just have to raise the issue of CIA connection or American support. And then try to spoil the entire mood. And also there's a huge number of Chinese who have been forced to speak up in defense of Chinese Communist Party's political stance. This time, however, everything was so different. In my almost 52 speaking events, and especially my university talks, I did 13 talks in universities and also other institutions, and I spoke a couple of places in cafes and restaurants also. In all of them, I haven't come across a single American leftist and apologetic people. And also in many of my speaking events, they were Chinese who were actually raising the concerns of surveillance on them by China from such a long distance. Right. So this time the experience was very different, and also notice that the number of Chinese students in America, especially in University of Chicago, Colorado, American University in Washington D.C., University of Minnesota, many of them, and also Harvard and Tufts. I understood that number of Indian students are rising, number of Chinese students are falling. So I could visibly see in Tufts University, for example, I did a speaking event there for almost about 60 students, and half of them are actually Indian. So I started by saying, "Hum aapke samne hain, bahut bahut namaste, aap yahan aane ke liye," and started with that. So you see, that's a great understanding and feel good having Indian students in my audience. So a lot of things are changing in America, and it is also one of the signals that China is getting isolated from Western world. In the Tibetan community, however, because I was speaking mostly on unity, I had a very good response from within the Tibetan community. And among the Tibetan students, I especially designed a slideshow presentation introducing Tibet as a land, its geography, culture, food, herbs, flowers, dress, costume, and also history and politics. I did 8 such speaking events for Tibetan youngsters. Out of 8, only 1 was done in Tibetan, others all done in English. That's mainly because they are telling me that Tibetan youngsters over there do not understand fully Tibetan. So therefore I had to do these speaking events mostly in English. That was a sad point. But then I did say to them that next time when I come, I want to do this in Tibetan. I want all of you to work hard on your Tibetan. I would want you to understand me when a Tibetan speaks to a Tibetan youngsters gathering.
Right. So coming back to your point of, taking pride in one's identity, keeping that fire alive in you, that reminded me of a question a fellow Tibetan who visited our office just a couple of days asked. She asked if I find the new generation of Tibetans less enthusiastic and less passionate about Tibetan freedom struggle. According to her observation, in her words, the fire that she used to see in the older generation of Tibetans, she said she can't find that fire in the younger generation of Tibetans anymore. So you have interacted with a lot of young Tibetans all around the world now, including India. What does your observation say?
Well, that's an outsider's perspective. I can outrightly speak about it very clearly because I've been involving myself in the Tibetan political activism for now about 26 years. So I know that the nature of political activism used to be more protest-oriented in the past. So therefore, it is less visible today of political activism that is based on protests. Now we are going into academia, we are going into literary, we are going to culture, and we are going to business. So you see, Tibetan youngsters are good in all this, and they are in all different arena. They are taking Tibet in so many different innovative spaces, and that is not too visible. So therefore, it is quite easy for an outsider to see that Tibetan youngsters are not involved in politics or political protests, or their kind of enthusiasm, which was quite visible. So I can completely understand this, but as someone who is involved in political activism and also academia and literature and also in cultural front, I see that we are in a very dynamic situation. Tibetan youngsters not only feel for Tibet, they are taking up their interest in so many interesting areas where the previous generation or even my generation could not reach out to or get themselves in such spaces earlier. So therefore, I'm always excited that we are in such an interesting place, and our youngsters are doing so well in so many different places. And this is a moment to be inspired and also get excited. And one of the things was also that His Holiness the Dalai Lama, even at the age of 86 now, 87, he takes Tibet every day, either online or in his daily audiences or in the teachings that he does. How many people are inspired? And he alone is such an inspiration for Tibetan youngsters. With His Holiness leading the movement in this way, this is of course the most exciting moment. Even as an activist, I can completely vouch for it.
Right, that's a very hopeful remark. Tsundue, educating and creating awareness on Tibet should be followed by active involvement in the activism in all forms for Tibetan freedom struggle. How can the exiled Tibetans, who are increasingly getting scattered all across the world, come together and put a collective effort in the movement for freedom in Tibet?
Right. One perspective is that Tibetans are getting scattered. Another perspective is that the Tibetans are getting spread and in so many areas and countries. Now I'm very excited that almost about 70,000 Tibetans are in Europe, America, Australia, Japan, all over the world. they are not only in those countries, they are citizens of those countries. So therefore now they have the citizenship right to raise the issue of Tibet in those countries, and their children are now in some of the best colleges, universities, and places of power and international contacts. I think these are exciting moments. So instead of saying we are getting scattered, we should say we are spreading our wings all over. And even in India, Tibetan youngsters are doing tremendously well in IT businesses, in service businesses, and there are places like Gurgaon, Faridabad, Bombay, Navi Mumbai, Bangalore are places where Tibetan youngsters are doing extremely well in so many different areas. So in each of these places, Tibetans are going there. Even though usually in Dharamshala or in Belukube or something, they may not wear a dress like this, but now they buy such a dress and go out and say, I'm Tibetan. That matters.
Right. Tsundula, the Azar Nafisi, the Iranian-American writer who is known in the world of literature of exile, has once said in an interview, and I quote, "The feeling of exile and loss of home is all about loss and absence. And through memory and through literature, you retrieve what you have lost. You make presence, then absence, and you create a portable world that neither tyrants nor nature can take away from you." And for her, is the safest place. That for her is the safest place. Is that the case with you? Tell us what your new book, Nang, Nowhere to Call Home, is about.
Yeah, my new book, Nang, in English I've written it Nowhere to Call Home. It sounds as if we are lost and it's sad. But what I also am saying in this book is, firstly, the title, Nang. Nang, the metaphor of Nang is much richer in Tibetan. Nang in Tibetan, as I'm saying in the back jacket, I'm saying Nang is home in Tibetan. It also means inside, inward, within, and the philosophical in. So for me, I am talking about the idea of Nang, home, here, because inside Tibet, where majority of the Tibetan population are, they are in their own homeland. They are in their home, but they have no freedom. And we say we have freedom in India and Nepal and America and Europe and everywhere. We say we have home, we have freedom, but we have no home. And on the speaking tour in the US and Canada, I was telling Tibetans over there, don't say that Canada and America is your home. These are land owned by Native Americans. They have been thrown out of their own homes, living in reservations. And white Americans are today living in those countries. Of course, America, United States of America is respected and aspired by people around the world to go and settle. But for Tibetans, our homeland is Tibet, and we must not forget. And it is also the calling of the homeland from Tibet. So therefore, for me, the idea of home is such an important place. And this may be my own perspective, but every Tibetan has a unique experience as a refugee. So therefore, they would also look at it, explore it in their own way. But for me, exile is a fertile ground. Exile makes you restless, on your feet, living precariously, at the same time living adventures every day. So therefore, I'm actually writing a new book which will read like adventures from page 1 till the end. These are going to be stories of Tibetan refugees from so many different parts of life, different forms of life, and such varied experiences they had of love, romance, tragedy, and also wives emerging after 20 years and realizing that there is a kid between them. Such interesting stories I have. So for me, exile is that space. Otherwise, a free and independent country, independence brings in complacency, and you seem to then talk only about justice. But as a refugee living in exile, your quest is freedom, and freedom requires you to do much more then maintaining independence with complacency. So you see, freedom asks more from people, and we obviously have to live up to that kind of a demand. So therefore, for me, in exile, being a refugee is such a empowering moment.
That's why you said for you, freedom is the home.
For me, the search for freedom is one. Of course, there is the political independence of Tibet, but on the other hand, personally, for me, in search of home, it's a journey where you personally undergo change, and you continue to liberate yourself from your complacency, from your laziness, from your fatigue, from your personal desire for comfort and convenience, and wake up and seek new areas of freedom. So therefore, it's such a live experience and liberating experience. And it will be odd to say, but I wish this freedom struggle continues, and this is such a rich life. It may be even a tragedy if we reach independence, raise our flag, then we all become lazy people.
Right, very interesting perspective, Tsundue. In many ways, politics is the major reason for the growth in the poetic interest among people, particularly the teenagers and the young millennials in the West. You talked about Tibetans spreading across the world and entering in different areas and aspects of life and politics in those countries. How would you like to describe the level of interest and involvement of the exiled Tibetan community in literature in general, and in understanding and employing activism through literature?
Well, now, literature is one area, I have to say, the main bulk of Tibetan literature, even today, happens in Tibetan language, and rightfully and deservingly, it must be like this. Much of the Tibetan literature continue to be produced from Tibet, even in exile. Almost everybody can write Tibetan, read Tibetan, except the older generation, like my parents who couldn't go to school. So Tibetan readership is much bigger in Tibetan community, and therefore the little writing in English, where I'm also a member of it, it's a very small community in terms of writers. We can actually literally count how many Tibetan writers are there writing English. But I think it's a great step, and it's not just uniquely Tibetan. In all communities, writers are always a small number, because that would require you to not only be able to write something, jot down, but write in a new language of creativity, a creative language. Not only that, and also the discipline and believing in the power of writing and making writing your livelihood and your lifestyle. Yeah, so all of that takes a lot for someone to become a writer. For us, it is the older, the seniors or the previous generation, starting from Professor Dawa Nurbu and Tsering Shakya, Jamya Nurbu, K. Thundu, Gebu Tsering, Tenzin Sonam. These are the people who we read when I was in school. I didn't see much creative writing like poetry or novels, but we had seen biography, autobiographies, and also political commentaries and history. So these were interesting to see. But now a challenge for the younger generation Tibetans is that you have a unique Tibetan experience. You have a unique Tibetan language. And so the imagination is, how would it sound if I said this in English? And that is the challenge in becoming a Tibetan writer. So I do see that in the community there aren't many writers in English, but I think we have some numbers. Tempun Kesang. These are our new writers that we have been able to publish, and Tenzin Digi in New York. And best news is Sring Yangzom Lama, who had become a bestseller already in Canada. So we are always very excited. My age is Pujung Disonam. Thingwang Motomba, who is in Canada. So you see, and Thingnamge Korsa. So we are not many who are writing in English, but nonetheless we are able to present certain ideas, and I hope this may be an inspiration for younger generation Tibetans to think of writing, because we need to tell our story by Tibetan, our Tibetan story in our own uniquely created Tibetan language, even in English language, which is even for us second language. But then we have to tell our story by ourselves.
Of course. Tsundula, I was thinking of Rupi Kaur, the popular poet in this day and age. Her books and poetry brought the poetic movement among the people of color. And your poems, just like hers, are political and empowering. Would you like to throw some light on the power of literature in the Tibetan freedom struggle?
In Tibet, one of the most important leadership provided to the people, that too of imagination, is the Tibetan writers. And therefore Tibetan writers are most persecuted in Tibet, because it is these Tibetan writers, Shokdung, Shokjang, and now Theorang, Nyen. These are the writers who have given Tibetan people a new imagination, an alternative world, and providing voice to the people. And so therefore you see, when you need to say something, most people are not gifted with the power to articulate what you have to say in a striking new phrase, idiom, or a stanza. And also for most common ordinary people to formulate an idea out of a very convoluted, complex, something that is personal at the same time political, it is not easy for them to formulate this into a statement or a title or an image. It is difficult. But poets are able to not only understand that and then translate that into a writing, maybe a title, maybe image. And in writing poetry, it involves creating images, and also in the rhythmic form of a thought, and also in terms of sound. So it sounds that so very rich. So therefore poetry can be most inspiring, encouraging, and so rich that the more you read, the more there is there to understand in poetry. So poetry inspires people when words fail. Poetry, gives you makes you see things which are opaque and banned and repressed. Poetry gives you that visible imagery of things that have been banned, torn, destroyed. Also, and poetry also gives you the space to see that has been erased, that have been kept away from public memory, and that have been repressed, and that have been made impossible. Poetry makes it possible, and not only making it possible, but giving a visual image of it to people just by the power of words.
Nice. Right. Tenzin Tsundue, thank you for being with us and sharing your positive perspectives on all these areas that we talked about today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And lastly, I just feel that it is not just the writers who should take this lead. Now in exile and also in Europe and America, there are a number of Tibetan youngsters who can speak well, who have great formulation of words. They could go out and speak. We need more speakers. We need speakers who can go to colleges, universities, schools, cafes, restaurants, and read and speak and tell their story. Most of us have amazing stories, but just because we are within the Tibetan community, we feel that our story is so very mundane and easy. But such kind of stories of escape from Tibet, living in poverty in refugee camps, and also making our own life from scratch. These are inspiring stories. We must tell these stories to the world, in cafes, in colleges, in universities. And this is something that I've been able to do. And I see there is such power in this. And not just political activism and protests, but take our story to the world.
Right. Yeah. So that was our today's episode of In Conversation with Tibettv. Our today's guest is Tenzin Tsundue, and we talked about his recent Talking Tibet Tour in the United States and Canada, his recently released book Nang, Nowhere to Call Home, and writing activism. Tsundula, can we wrap this interview up with a recital of one of your favorite poems?
Not a favorite, but because there is not much time, I can read a short one. This is called Horizon, and this has to do with travel. Horizon. From home you have reached the horizon here, from here to another, here you go, from there to the next to the next, horizon to horizon, every step is a horizon. Count the steps and keep the number, pick the white pebbles and funny strange leaves. Mark the curves and cliffs around, for you may need to come home again.
Thank you, Tsundula.
Thank you. Thank you.